Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Our next panel is entitled Resilience, a Gateway to Opportunity. Our co-host for this next featured session is KCOC, the Korean NGO Council for Overseas Development Cooperation. And it's no one but the Secretary General of KCOC who will moderate this session, Mr. Tae-sik Jo. We are very honored that you're with us. Please introduce the panel. The floor is all yours.
Thank you very much. 여러분 안녕하십니까?
I will be moderating this session. I am from KCOC. My name is Cho Tae-sik. The topic for this session is Resilience, a Gateway to Opportunity. I am sure that we are all very well aware of the concept of resilience. It's returning to the original state. The reason why we selected resilience as the topics is as follows: because the current era is in urgent need of this concept. In this era, the biggest challenge is to achieve the SDGs, the goals for all of us on Earth. But the environment to achieve these goals is deteriorating very rapidly. And so resilience is a way for us to bring back the adequate environment for achieving SDGs. And it's about achieving the SDGs as planned. That is a big task on our hands. Are we able to achieve these goals? That will depend on resilience. Will we be able to equip ourselves with resilience? That will be what our world and our future pivots on. So we have invited 3 members of this panel, and these 3 gentlemen are those who are the most equipped to discuss this topic. We have invited 3 organizations. KCOC is a gathering of overseas development NGOs. We have over 140 organizations participating under KCOC. And we also have 4.4 million sponsors for our 140 members. We are active in 100 countries, and we have invited 3 organizations to join us on this panel. I will start with my left. We have with us President Cho Myung-hwan of World Vision Korea. Then we have with us President Yoo Won-sik of Korea Food for Hungry International. And we also have Board Chair Oh Jun of Save the Children. This is how we will proceed in the next hour. We have half an hour for 2 different topics, and the first half hour will be a talk show. We will be sharing our ideas on specific topics, and then for the second half, we will be inviting the presentations of different organizations and listen to what they are doing on site. And if time allows, we will also have a Q&A session inviting the audience to join us. So let's start the first half of this session. So I will be presenting 2 questions for the first part of our dialogue. We will first talk about resilience. Why is resilience important at this point in time? The second question is, in order to create and strengthen resilience, what should be the role of NGOs? And what are the strengths of NGOs in fostering resilience? So that is the first question that I pose to our panel. So the first question is, why is resilience important at this point in time? Let's start with President Cho. Well, I was a professor and I studied immunity when I was a professor, and I think that's quite closely related to resilience. Some people felt sicker during COVID-19 and some people were not so sick. And then the speed of recovery after suffering from COVID-19 was different from person to person because we have different immune systems. And I think that really is related to the concept of resilience. When there is a disaster, it's very important to help people, but resilience is also very important. So we need to foster resilience so that people can recover themselves from disasters, because disasters happen very often and disasters happen on a massive scale, and we have multifaceted disasters that happen. So rescue is very important, but at the same time, we also need to foster resilience so that people can rebound from their situation. 1 year ago, I talked about how achieving SDGs is at a very big challenge, and now a year later, the situation is even worse off. Many experts are already mentioning that SDG number 1, eradicating poverty, and SDG 2, eradicating hunger, so ending hunger. These two goals, it's impossible to achieve these two goals in the set time frame, according to many experts. But nevertheless, why is it so difficult to achieve the SDGs at this point in time? It's because of climate change, the pandemic, and international conflicts. These are elements that lead to the aggravation of situations around the world. And if we take a look at what regions are the most impacted, and we see that the regions with low resilience are more affected by international conflicts, disasters, and the pandemic. And so, in order to achieve the SDGs, we need to foster resilience. That is indeed very important. Thank you.
So you presented 3 keywords as a root cause of the challenges. First is climate change. Second is the pandemic. And third is war. Now, against this backdrop, we have Mr. Won-sik, president from the Korea Food for Hungry International. Climate change, food, these are the areas in which you have a lot of on-field experience and insights to share. So let me add to that. So the need for resilience can be explained because of 3 specific reasons. Due to changes brought on by climate change. And one of the reasons why we have starvation and hunger, because the frequency of disasters will only accelerate going forward. That would be the first reason. According to research, 110 large disasters have taken place over the year. And as a result of that, about more than $100 billion in damages were caused. Now, as the frequency of such disasters occurrence continues, by 2030, there will be 560 cases of disasters taking place in a year. Now, that means that the magnitude of the damages will only grow bigger. That is why a resilience of the community will become even more important going forward. And as the previous speaker spoke out, we need to have a resilience. So the weaker countries in times of disasters, of course, will have to become more resilient because there are systems that become collapsed, and there are systems that become resilient because disasters will strike any country, regardless of a country being rich and poor, but resilience will be determined by the responsiveness and the capabilities that a country has. That is why it is very important to build a capacity within the community so that they can be resilient to any shocks or disasters that may happen. And we're living in a hyper-connected world. We talked about climate change, war in Ukraine, and, for example, drought in Europe. They're causing food crisis issues, food security crisis that's leading to rising prices in food and also leading to a food crisis. A butterfly effect, a disaster taking place in one country will be felt in another form on the other part of the world, on the opposite side of the world. That is why all stakeholders have to be involved, have to be together, and that is why resilience becomes a critical concept to note. Thank you very much. Won-shik mentioned, I think I'm able to see the commonalities between the two speakers. Now, the frequency of disasters, as well as the magnitude, they're becoming greater. That's accelerating all the or aggravating the seriousness of the challenges confronting us. There is also a dilemma. More vulnerable a country is, the concept of resilience becomes all the more important. But because the country is vulnerable, they cannot equip themselves with resilient capabilities. So that's a dilemma, especially in terms of protection of children. And those activists in the field, such as Save the Children, I wonder how you think about this dilemma on top of the general questions. So, Ambassador Oh-jun, can you share your insights? So, two speakers have given us a lot of insight. So I will try to say something different. So the term resilience, that's the topic of this discussion. It's translated into 회복 탄력성 in Korean. I think it's a difficult term to translate into the Korean language. Nevertheless, it is going back to the normalcy, back to normalcy. I don't think this is about going back to normalcy. I don't think we can ever go back to normalcy, what we used to be, especially looking at various crises that have taken place over the course of 3 years. For example, this misfortune did not just happen upon us. It was a structural issue. We actually create a world in which these problems were bound to occur as a result of the development of civilization, globalization. There's that inevitable links amongst these factors. And it gives me all the more confidence when I look into this issue deeper. Why do we have climate crisis? It's because we're using too much energies. We're depleting all these resources and we're emitting all these carbons into the atmosphere. So unless we make formidable efforts, we can never go back to normalcy. What about Ukraine war? It's just another aspect of war. Together with the advancement of civilization, we continue to develop our military arms, weapons, and the UN peacekeeping system. It's quite loose. So a war like war in Ukraine was bound to occur. What about the COVID-19 pandemic? There has to be that certain healthy distance between humans and animals, but humans actually outnumbered animals, and we had too many livestock. So virus on the street from the livestock, it transferred onto human beings and led to disease outbreak. Now we think that, well, we just had an unfortunate event called COVID-19, so we should go back to where we used to be. So it's just not possible. So all these crises, it's a slow burning crisis. We use a term to portray the situation quite a lot. So as Mr. Cho said, children, the poor people, refugees, they're even more vulnerable in the situation, bound to suffer even more.
Thank you very much. Resilience is a word that's very difficult to translate into Korean, but in the past, resilience was translated into a word that is similar to recovery in the Korean language. But I think that actually portrays the aspect of going back to the original state. But resilience actually is about going to a new normal. And I think that it's a very difficult concept to translate. And so the concept resilience, it's not about going back to the original state, but rather it's about going to a evolved state. I think that is something that we have to think about for the word resilience. I now have the second question. And I would like to go on to the second question. And if time allows, we will give further opportunities for you to speak. So we all now know that resilience is very important. But in order to create resilience and strengthen resilience, what is the role of NGOs? And what are the strengths of NGOs that can be used to strengthen resilience? Ambassador Oh?
This is related to what I said before. So the things that we call crises, are they happening because we're running out of fortune? It is because we've been developing our civilizations and pursuing globalizations. We have brought this crisis onto ourselves. So inevitably, these problems can happen to us. Then how should we respond to them? Or should we just continue the civilization, the development? Should we just forget about taking KTX? Should we just take a slow-moving trains like Mugunghwa? That doesn't become an answer. So globalization is one way. Whether we want it or not, it's going to go ahead. It's going to move ahead. So we have to deal with the side effects that are brought on by civilization development. I know I don't want to sound like a skeptic, but I'm sorry to say, but I have to point out that the sovereign nation states, for the last 300 years or so, global relations have been built and operated within that system. Now they have their sovereignty, their power, strengths. They're trying to maintain and strengthen their powers and strengths. And they want to work in partnership. But they have to, but rather than taking that route, they're very nationalistic. They're just focused solely on their national interest. They're trying to just appeal to their audience, their public. Even a democratic country, they make populist decisions rather than making wise, smart, informed decisions. So we cannot really just look to governments for answers. That is why NGOs, civil society, they really have an important role to play. I don't want to sound so skeptic, but so let me end my comments on a positive note. So this era of democracy, where freedom and human rights are being expanded across the world, where people are consciously trying to reshape the future, backed up by their action without being pressured by the government. If we have more countries going in that direction, we can really be enlightened, and we can really go beyond just looking, taking care of our own self-interest, but taking care of others' people's interest as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You did talk about how it's a negative aspect, but rather than saying that it's a negative aspect, I think it's about talking about the truth that we tend to try and get around. Truth sometimes is painful to face. And so at times we try to get around it, but you did mention that, and I think that was quite brave on your part. So it's not negative at all, it's rather quite brave. And you can't only rely on the state you mentioned, and I believe that we can't really rely on private companies as well. So that's why we have to rely on citizens. And so civic societies are very important in this era, in urgent need of resilience. And so we need to focus on this sector rather than the government and private companies. Let us now go to President Yu.
So, talked about the concept of the well-being for humanity and the world. I think that expression is very important because technology is really rapidly changing. We're talking about GPT-3 and we're talking about AI. So that's about revolution in time and space. That is something that we cannot stop. So of course there are side effects coming from technology development. Because we're so solely focused on that, we tend to forget about the environment that we really have to take care of for humanity and the world. That has actually triggered the crisis of climate. And taking an example of Korea, for example, when we were taking woods for fire, of course, we were felling the trees for fire, then we would end up actually destroying all the forests. So as a result, we were using fossil fuels, and as a result of that, we now have to think about CO2 emissions as a result of using so much fossil fuels. Of course, back then, we were trying to save trees. So that is why we decided to resort to fossil fuels. So we were really not looking far into the future when we were making that decision. I'm sure it was made out of goodwill. So let's now talk about the role, identity of NGOs and the third sector. I think we can describe this in three words. First is representative. Second, supporter. Third is actors on the ground. So NGOs have to become the spokesperson. The most influential role that an NGO can play is to represent the interests and be an advocate of a very weak, vulnerable community, and to provide support for them to be able to recover and to recover. And second is for them to become a supporter. For any community to revive itself, we have to revitalize the community by empowering each individual. An NGO should not become a main actor, but become a supporting actor so that communities themselves can rebuild themselves by having technology transfer, capital investment, and so forth, so that they can go beyond their own hurdles. So NGO should become that supporter in terms of building resilience in communities. Third, the last final point is that on the international development grounds or fields, we have these international relief organizations. They're right at the front field. When Ukraine war broke out, they came up with the evacuation plan for the refugees in Ukraine, and they were monitoring political situations there. They came up with the emergency plans as well. And for example, many organizations such as anti-starvation organizations, there were people that were working out on the field. That's why they were at the front field of helping these people in the communities. So the third sector, the NGO sector, will continue to play the very important role. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I was not able to listen to the latter part because you mentioned how you used to cut down trees as firewood, and 20 years ago I visited North Korea for over the course of about 18 months because of the Kedo project. We would land at the Pyongyang Sunhan Airport, and we would go to Hangsan to have our meeting there. And it took about 2 hours on the bus. And I could see all of the mountains that we drove by did not have any trees, but Myeongsan actually had a little bit of trees. And as I was driving for 2 hours, I could see that there were no trees on the mountains. And it was quite a long time ago, but I feel it's really quite heartbreaking to think about it. And your statement reminded me of that scene. And so I was not able to hear the second half of your statement. Well, at World Vision, we always think about helping people in difficulty. And what we do is we first go into the area, and then we would provide materials and water, and we don't leave that area. We stay there for 10 to 15 years. Why do we stay there for such a long time? It's because of resilience. We stay there until we foster resilience. How can we achieve resilience in that area? We use two methods. First, we stay there for a long time. As I mentioned before, once we're there, we stay there for 10 to 15 years in the local community. And so we stay there with them, and we wait until they are able to respond to disasters and have that power of resilience. And that's why we stay there for 10 to 15 years. And we also work on establishing a social system. Second, in order to foster resilience, the second method that we use is community participation. Of course, we are an expert in helping local communities, but we don't stop there. Since we're there for 10 to 15 years, we have local participation every step of the way. So we are able to transfer how we build resilience. And so for 10 to 15 years, we stay and build resilience. And in that process, the local community also learns how to build resilience. And once we're sure that they have equipped themselves with resilience, that's when we leave the local area. We have local participation every step of the way, and we also build resilience. And when we build resilience, what happens is in the past, the local communities did not have a dream for the future. They don't have any plans for the future. But once they are equipped with resilience, then even after we leave the local community, we see that the community plans their future, they dream, and they realize their dreams through their actions. And so from 2020, for the last 3 years, we have worked on the independence of 315 villages, and by 2025, we will be working on leaving about 650 communities so that they can build their own communities. Well, I think I have done very well for timekeeping. We have 3 minutes left, so we will accept just one question from the floor. So we have listened to our 3 panelists, and now, if there are any questions, we will accept just one question from the floor. If you don't have any questions at this point in time, you can feel free to ask questions at the end of the presentations. For the second half of our session, we will be listening to what each organization is doing on site. We will start with the presentation of President Cho Myung-hwan of World Vision Korea. My presentation slides, please. So World Vision works to build resilience in local communities through various activities. And one of our prime examples is to work with climate change. We call this project Farmers Managed Natural Regeneration. It's FMNR for short. Farmers Managed Natural Regeneration. So this project has 3 elements. First, this project uses very simple techniques. So for example, in order to make sure that trees grow, we would prune. So pruning is very important. So the local community can use tools that are available to prune trees so that the trees would grow. So rather than planting new trees, it actually regenerates the natural environment much more quickly if we prune existing trees. And it's a simple technique and it's a low-cost technique. Therefore, it can be used and it's applicable to all communities. So here you can see on the map that this is already being used in over 20 countries. Second, it's community-centered, as we call this farmer-managed natural regeneration. The farmers, the local community, actually lead these projects. Women and even farmers with disabilities participate as leaders. World Vision, with its long experience, know that sustainable protection of an area is only possible by including the local community. Not only does this benefit the environment, but the whole of the community. So through these projects, let's take a look at how the life of the local community changes. Please take a look at this video.
We have been suffering from long drought spells.
We lack food, so sometimes children sleep on an empty stomach.
We have lost animals, crops, rivers dry up, people move from one place to another, looking for pasture, and even some die.
Los tamba mahira sira liusi kapasitasaun sira nebehetang sir vision sira bel haria sira ne rairasi no sira bele hadia sira ne to sira ka saira saira me maka durante sira etana bel hadia na sira ne.
So as you have seen in the video, this is Somalia, and we have been experimenting in Somalia for over a decade, and you can see a complete change in the local environment. So on the left, we have the area that did not conduct the pruning project, and on the right, you can see the area with a pruning project. This is Ethiopia, and this is Ghana. So as you can see, in many different areas, we are able to see the impact of our pruning project. So once the soil is regenerated, then the life of the local community, including the children, recovers. We are able to build resilience, and the soil under trees can absorb up to 67 times the water compared to that without trees. And we are also able to contribute to food security. Crop yield is increased by 50 to 70% when there is shade from trees. And once we restore trees, we are able to provide 23% of the emission reductions. And with the recovery of trees, we are able to then participate in carbon credits that leads to new income sources. That actually leads to the cooling effect on community tensions by reducing the competition over resources. So we are working with the World Agriculture Organization and UN SDG, and they have named our project as a good practice for SDGs. World Vision will continue to contribute to SDGs, in particular SDG 1 and 2, eradicating poverty and hunger. Thank you very much.
Next, we're going to listen to Korea Food for Hungry International. The one term really comes to me so relevant, a transforming landscape. Listening to this, it's about physical transformation of the land, but it's also about transforming the horizon of our mindset, our reinventing our thinking. So it really has a lot of implications. Looking at the pictures before and after for 10 years, it's very clear to me. President Wu, before I begin my presentation, first of all, as Mr. Cho mentioned, I actually have a question to you. Would it be okay? So many development organizations, it's not about just giving people with food aid, clothes, shelters. It's more than that. It's about building a resilience within the communities. And more than 300 communities were able to become self-sufficient. So that in and of itself is very meaningful. So why do we have these relief organizations? It is to provide help to the community so that they can help one another. That's the ultimate goal of having these relief organizations in the first place. Same goes for anti-starvation strategies. So we have the commonalities here. But what's really challenging is after these communities become self-sufficient, monitoring or follow-up are some of the areas in which improvement can be made. So how is World Vision doing in terms of monitoring after the communities become self-sufficient? So thank you very much for the question.
So we have actually left some of these communities, but as, for example, if your company sells television sets, then you provide after service if there are any repairs that are necessary. That's the same for us as well. So even after we leave the community, every 2 to 6 months or so, we would actually visit the community. And we ask them if there's anything else that they need or any questions that they have, having become self-sufficient after a long time. And we would provide them with help. And if they need additional resources or materials, we would provide that additional help as well. So we do go back and forth for about the next 3 years.
So let me share some examples for starvation issues as well. Of course, I've been working very hard to build a future for a society that is free from physical, spiritual, and social, emotional poverty and instill hope in others as well. That is our vision. That is to build sustainable development in the communities, and for those communities that are receiving help as well as those that are providing help, we want to see transformation on both sides to provide resources to the areas that are most needing such resources to become the supporters for the communities. That's the first vision for our organization. And for sustainable development, we work with social volunteers on the ground to collect related information. And when we design projects, we focus on transfer of the projects and to build self-sufficiency in the communities by building community-led organizations. And third, after assistance is completed and finished, we would continue to provide mentoring so that development becomes sustainable and self-sustaining. That is our exit strategy. And Dr. Zhou said that you have about 3 years for monitoring after an action is taken. Same goes to our organization as well. So 2 to 3 years for monitoring afterwards. First is Ukrainian Emergency Relief Project. Once the war broke out last year, we put in place humanitarian support framework and provided goods and services to more than 120,000 people, provided them with food, shelters, as well as psychological and emotional support. We conducted relief activities in a total of 13 hubs that are still being operated and are receiving support. We also employed Ukraine refugees to provide recipient-oriented relief. And of course, it is important to provide safe shelters foremost, because their hometowns are destroyed overnight and are occupied by the Russian military, so they had no choice but to leave their hometowns. Now, in large-scale shelters, they can stay for maybe 1 to 2 weeks at most, and especially families with small children, they were put at a disadvantage. So women, including children, prefer to stay in shelters that would be provided by organizations like us rather than large-scale shelters, because they would be able to feel a sense of comfort. Because there were many people who had to leave their homes, and we provided support so there's no educational losses. We also provided some mental support and counseling so children can recover quickly from the trauma brought on by war. And also the second case I want to share with you is Pakistan emergency relief. Of course, there were hit by climate change. About 1/3 of the land was submerged underwater. It's because of the flood, and there was heat wave even prior to flood. And also ice was melting on the top of the mountain, and the sea level rose as well. So it was a combination of multiple crises. So first, emergency relief supplies were sent to families. We provided people with mosquito nets and also emergency relief food, products and services, and at the same time. And also listen to the voice of the field. And also water resource development project was carried out at the same time. And also infrastructures that were flooded. And also drinking water issues. We wanted to bring some solution to that. So to 50,000 people, these people received a direct as well as indirect support. And other than, and there was an African, Mali, Madagascar, Zambia, Tanzania projects were carried out to provide food aid on an emergency basis. And it's not just a one-off support. We're trying to become a supporter for them on a long-term basis as well. So resilience in a community, it means not self-sufficiency, but it means sustainability. And these communities that are disconnected from the world are less resilient from crises. That is why it's important for all of us to move beyond boundaries and borders to build healthy relationships. And through such a network of collaboration, local communities can be equipped with resilience and capabilities to recover from the crisis. We have to be the bridge that connects these different dots. That would be the most important role for us to play. Thank you very much. That's about connecting the resources. That's the mission at hand, a role to play. So let's hear from Save the Children. I'm here to represent Save the Children. Dr. Wu from KFHI shared with us a case in Ukraine. I want to turn your attention to Rohingya. These were the ethnic groups who were living in Myanmar, but due to political pressure, they had to relocate to a neighbor country, Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. It was a very unknown place, but this has actually become a household name. It's the name itself, Cox's Bazar. Quite peculiar, but anyway, this became a place that accepted a lot of Rohingya refugees. Whether it is Ukraine or Rohingya, why do we have refugees in the first place? How can we prevent such problem from taking place in the first place from a proactive point of view? But of course, our organizations were involved in humanitarian aid work in the 19th century. The Red Cross, of course, it is the most symbolic organization. Henri Dunant, who is a Swiss businessman, happened to go to Italy and saw a war taking place between Italy and France. Of course, they had guns. So in the field, for example, the counterparts, the armies of the both sides, they would start shooting and people would be shot and they would fall, and the shooting would be exchanged between the two sides. And of course, the guns were not as powerful as the guns that we have today. So those people that are gunned down would be rescued. And if you, for example, do some first aid measures, first aid actions, then the soldiers would be able to survive, would be able to live. So even if a war has to go on, at least if people can intervene, can step in and rescue these people, then of course, once you have that band over you, Red Cross, they would stop shooting, they would stop fighting, and they would let Red Cross to go in and take those wounded soldiers for treatment. So humanitarian work, I think it's going along the same line as well. It's basically rooted in the same spirit. And of course, this is really needed, but that's not a fundamental solution. Because let's say you have a fire. Now you're a firefighter. So I can go anywhere and put the fire. Of course, it's important to have that firefighting capability, but we have to think about why we have a fire in the first place. For example, when you're building a house, you use, for example, fireproof materials, and you put in place sprinklers from a more fundamental point of view to prevent fire from taking place in the first place. The same goes for refugee issue. We have relocation, refugees, because of natural disasters and war. Why do people engage in war? Why do we have natural disasters? That's a fundamental approach. That's the thinking that is needed. And NGOs have to think along that line. But of course, because I'm here to speak about humanitarian aspects, so I will just focus my talk on humanitarian actions. So the ethnic group, the Rohingyas, they're very misfortunate people because they were living in Myanmar, but they had a different religion from the majority mainstream. So they were put under a lot of oppression as well as pressure. Of course, if it's to a bearable level, then they would still manage to live in their home community, but they couldn't bear that burden anymore. So about 1 million people relocated to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So we had that Save the Children project in that place. About $15 million of support was provided, and also Korea Save the Children was involved as well. Last year, even previous year as well, $2 million of aid was provided to the refugees. Most of the aid is focused on children and teenager youth centers, youth camps. Now, especially in the international law, children are those that are under 18 years of age. So usually it's about 30% of population that's children. But Korea's birth rate is so low, so children is even less than 30% of the total population. But on international average, that's about 30% of the total, any national population. But refugees, 50% of refugees are children, because these are people who have fled their hometowns. It's usually the children and the women who have fled their hometowns because men have to go to war. So half of the refugees are children. So protecting them, how better to protecting them, that's very important. And if you live in a refugee camp, of course, survival is at stake, and also education losses take place. You cannot just put on hold your education, because there's a timing, there's a window of opportunity for education. You can't just put it on hold for 1 year. The opportunity never comes back. That is why, of course, they have to survive, but at the same time, they have to learn. So, Save the Children, Korea activist. This is how the Korean activist has visited the Rohingya Children's Center to have a dialogue, conversation with people there. So, how can children at refugee camps continue to learn, continue to receive education, and to ensure their survival at the same time? Of course, important to access food, medical treatment, but there's also many forms of child abuse, sexual exploitation, violence. Children are most often at risk of being abused at the refugee camps. So we're trying to come up with a way in which we can provide some help in that regard. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much. It seems that we are able to accept one question from the floor if there are any. Are there any questions from the floor? If not, I think since we have about 5 minutes left, we can have this opportunity to ask questions within the panel. So if there are any questions to each other, or if there are any additional comments that you would like to add, maybe I can give you a minute or so. Would you like to begin? Chairman Yu?
We've been talking about the notion of resilience. That's a very high level concept. It's maybe an easy concept to grasp at the same time. But at the beginning of the session, our president talked about Sector 1, Sector 2, and Sector 3. Of course, sectoral approach and activities are important, but it's important to collaborate amongst the sectors, to have partnership across the board. So we even talk about Sector 4 these days. Relief work to continue to prosper, and for low-income countries to become more resilient. The government, industries, and organizations like us, volunteer organizations, CSOs, have to communicate more effectively, have to understand one another, and to generate synergies to make everything better. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for adding more meaning to what I have asked as a question. So all three things have to go hand in hand. I do believe that citizens, individuals, civic society groups, they all become a catalyst amongst the three elements. And so the three elements need to come together to create a synergy effect. Next, maybe President Cho could provide some final comments. Well, we have quite a large young audience today, so that gives me a source of hope. When I was young, the concept of Korea was quite clear, and who our neighbors are very clear. But it seems that the world is one at this moment in time. And so in the past, Koreans were active only in Korea. But for those of you sitting in the audience, you will be working all over the world. And so there's a reason why we're helping people in difficulties across the planet. Not only are we helping them, but it's because their difficulties impact all of us. The war in Ukraine, it's not just an issue between Russia and Ukraine, but because of this war, the whole world is impacted. It's impacting resources, it's impacting the economy, it's impacting the supply chain, it's impacting raw materials. And so the whole world is not living independently, but it's almost as if the whole world is a single country. And so it's not just an issue of Korea. It's not just an issue of a specific country. We need to be interested in each other's issues because those issues will impact all of us. And so that is why we need to provide aid to countries around the world. In particular, as Korea is emerging as one of the leaders in this global society, we should not just be satisfied that we have become a large economy, but we need to be respected through your activities. I look very much forward to that. Thank you very much for expressing your expectations for the next generation. President Oh.
Well, just reiterate what I said, but let me sum it up this way. For the last 3 years, all of us in this world have been undergoing this crisis of war, the pandemic and climate change. They're just not happening out of blue, but they're happening as a result of structural issues. And it had to come to this because of those issues in structure, civilization, development, globalization. We cannot think about the current status without looking into that framework. Now, civilization, as we know it after industrial revolution, that has led to this. For example, people that were making shoes 400 years ago, and people that were making shoes 5,000 years ago in Egypt, they were probably using same techniques to make shoes. Civilization did not just progress at a very slow pace, but over the past 300 years or so, it exponentially developed. The two speakers, of course, in order to save the trees, and they decided to go deeper into the grounds to get the fossil fuels. Of course, we needed enormous amount of energy because we needed to develop our industries. These are, for example, the trees that were, for example, existing 100 million years ago. But why do we need that type of energy? Because we have to make ships, make cars, make airplanes, to travel, and to make arms, and also to use electricity. We need a lot of energy. That is why we're, for example, taking the trees that used to exist 100 million years ago and to burn it up, and that's actually heating up the earth. So what do we need to do to stop this phenomenon? We can only do so by thinking about our civilization, what we do every single day. It's great to be able to travel long distances in a day. How was this possible like many years ago when we didn't have the bullet train? So we cannot stop the progress of civilization. And we cannot sustainably develop our civilization. So what's civilization? Where are we? So we really have to think about it from a fundamental point of view. It's not just about using this, or preventing the use of disposable goods. Thank you.
So in just a single minute, he talked about the evolution of civilization across 300 years. Thank you very much. So we have now 3 minutes left, so let me conclude the session. Today in the morning, this is a thought that came to mind, the word resilience. As I was thinking about this, I thought about from supporting actor into the star. So resilience was the supporting actor for a very long time, and it just wasn't visible enough. But this word, resilience, is now in center light. So the era is calling resilience to step into the center light. So the star called resilience, if it acts well and if it shines, then I believe that it will definitely contribute to achieving the SDGs. It will indeed provide a big push for the SDGs. In order to enable this, as having listened to the last hour of dialogue, we need 3 things. It could be 3 conditions. So if we wish to do this, first, we need to go back to the new normal. Well, Ambassador O talked about how we shouldn't be going back to the normal, but rather go back to the new normal. So we need to redefine resilience. And then second, we need to go back to the basics. So when we see rapid changes and mega changes at this level, then what we need to do is to go back to the basics. So we need to go back to the basics. And then The third condition is we need to stop the talk and we need to be able to sacrifice ourselves. So we need to make sure that we put our words into action. That is what we need to put in place. And if we put all of these three conditions in place, then we will definitely be able to have hope for the future. Thank you very much to our panel members and also all those who have joined us in person as well as online. Thank you very much for your participation, and thank you to our host. Thank you very much.
Secretary General, thank you KCOC, thank you panelists for this very interesting insight into resilience, truly a gateway to opportunity. We are almost nearing the end of day 2 of the GEEF. But we have one more session in store for you. It is a session hosted by the Ban Ki-moon Center for Global Citizens, and it's about greening education in times of climate crisis. So please do join us after a break of 15 minutes. Thank you very much.